H.P. Albarelli Jr. joins us to talk about his 2009 book, A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Cold War Experiments. An investigative reporter and writer for over 20 years, H.P., or Hank Albarelli, has worked at the Carter White House and for the U.S. Treasury Department. He had been doing articles on biological warfare and intelligence when he stumbled across documents about a case dating back to CIA and Army projects of the 1950s, known as MKULTRA, Artichoke, and Bluebird. He had reasons to believe then that the suicide of former Army Special Operations Division official Frank Olson was really a murder. Olson phoned his wife not long before his death, saying in a strange voice, "I've made a terrible mistake." Not long before, Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD. We asked Hank Albarelli why this old CIA history began to interest him so much.
Like everybody, I can recall the exposures of the mid-'70s, 1975, 76, and 77, when all the LSD stuff was splashed across the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and including the Olson case. I remember specifically reading that article and thinking it was pretty incredible, and then, like most Americans, probably forgot about it within a week or two. But then I relocated from Washington, D.C. to Catonsville, Maryland, and through a series of events there, I became aware of the fact that a state mental hospital in Catonsville, Maryland, it's commonly called Spring Grove, but formerly called the Maryland Psychiatric Institute, had been used in the early 50s for a lot of covert experiments and private experiments, and there was probably a lot of crossover between the two, and I started looking into that just out of curiosity. It had nothing to do with the Olson case, but I managed to visit the facility a couple times, and a grounds person let me into a storage room where a lot of the old logs were kept for visitors to the facility. And I went through, I was especially interested in the early 50s because I knew that's when the experiments had started. And in looking at one of the logs, I came across a few names that were familiar from the newspapers, including Frank Olson's name. And he had visited Spring Grove on the same day that another man who worked with him and Dr. Harold Abramson had visited. Abramson, you may recall, was the physician that Olson was ultimately taken to the week of his death in New York. I think it was late 1950 when they initially visited there. So that piqued my curiosity about the Olson case, too. But I didn't do much about it until maybe 3 or 4 weeks later. There was a news article on the front page of the Metro section of the Washington Post concerning Frank Olson's body being brought up out of the grave to be reburied, but the remaining of the Olson family decided they also wanted a forensic investigation conducted into his death because there had always been doubts about his alleged suicide. So that piqued my interest in the Olson case, and I searched around for something well written on the case, and besides just newspaper articles, which were pretty sketchy, the only thing I could find was John Marks's book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which had what appeared to be a really good chapter on the Olson case in the book. But after I read that chapter a couple of times, there were just numerous things in it that made no sense to me. I talked to Marks, and he was convinced that Olson had committed suicide and there was nothing else to it. But I wasn't. There were too many strange things about just the death itself that bothered me. And after about a year, I started really digging into it. Initially, I was thinking about writing an article, but I realized within 2 or 3 months that the article would have been way overly long. I had too much information and not enough to counter any of the things that were bothering me. So I knew it was a book. I didn't know at that point in time how big it was going to be, though, and that it was going to take a little over 10 years.
What about Frank Olson as the expert at aerosol delivery systems for biological weapons? Talk about Fort Detrick, what you learned about Olson in that respect, and when you learned that, because that turned out to be very important.
I knew right from the start that Olson worked at Fort Detrick, or Camp Detrick, as it was called at the time that he was there. And I think according to Marx's book, Marx wrote that Olson was an expert in anthrax and the aerosol delivery of anthrax, but I found out that that was not true. Olson had little to nothing to do with anthrax. Olson was a laboratory worker initially at Fort Detrick, but not while they were working on anthrax. And when the Special Operations Division was created at Detrick, Olson transferred over to that in early 1950, and he was basically an administrator, but his specialty was protective clothing and protective gear that was used around experiments. And he was also always, when he was with SOD, at an administrator's level. For a little over a year, he was actually the director of the Special Operations Division. So he wasn't a workbench researcher, and I was able to come up with some records concerning experiments that had been conducted that Olson had been engaged in domestically. There was one in San Francisco, and it was clear that his job on that experiment was, again, protective clothing and making sure that everyone involved in it had the proper protections from whatever chemicals that were being handled.
We read in your book that witnesses testifying about MKULTRA, Operation Bluebird, and other of these secret programs involving LSD and other chemicals, that there was discussion very openly, very matter-of-factly, about aerosolizing LSD in a weaponized form and using it in bombs and using it against militaries, and how, that would be so-called humane warfare.
Right. That was actually first proposed by the research director at Edgewood Arsenal, a man called Luther Wilson Green. And when he first proposed that, it was 1949. And the Army seemed to be very much attracted to LSD as possibly a way to not fight violent warfare. It seems, in retrospect, and even then, it seemed rather ludicrous that they thought that. I assume they didn't know a whole lot about the drug, and I would guess, there's no reports to this effect, that they found out rather quickly that LSD wasn't good for warfare, but it wasn't until they conducted a number of experiments, both domestically and in Europe, that they were able to discover that. And then the emphasis, the use of LSD, evolved rather quickly into a technique for interrogations or just simple torture, or to surreptitiously dose someone to put them off balance or to embarrass them.
There was an instance that you covered of a U.S. soldier dosed, and he happened to be African American. Can you tell us about that case?
James A. Thornwell. Yeah, that's a pretty sad case. He was actually a soldier in Europe that, I think it was in France, as a matter of fact, that was suspected of, well, it's kind of vague, either stealing or passing documents on, and some of the documents may have had something to do with experiments that had been conducted in the 50s in France. And it's a good example of LSD in interrogation. He was confined to his quarters and dosed with LSD intentionally as part of an ongoing interrogation. And it went on for a good number of days and did some severe damage to him. And Thornley, as a result of that, actually I think he had an epileptic fit while he was in a swimming pool one day and drowned. But his case was interesting because it actually happened, I think, in the mid-'70s, or right before the Olson exposures, and during a time when everybody was under the impression that LSD use in interrogations had tapered off, but it hadn't. And indeed, it's still used today by the Army and the other services in interrogation settings. It's been used at Guantanamo. It's been used domestically with the young fellow from Chicago that was arrested right after 9/11, Jose Padilla, who's now in federal prison for the rest of his life. According to his lawyers, he was given LSD between 2 and 4 times.
Well, the key to this, of course, may be that it was ultimately the LSD that caused the soldier, Thornwell, to confess.
Exactly, because he couldn't take it anymore. He'd had no exposure to the drug prior to that. And giving somebody LSD in a strong amount as he was given. I think it was 150 or 170 mics. Can be a terrifying experience for somebody who's in a negative situation to begin with. It can be absolutely terrifying and mind-damaging in numerous ways.
Talk about these two medical doctors that were in Olson's life at the time of his death, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and Dr. Robert Lashbrook.
Lashbrook was with Olson the night he died. He was actually in the room the night Olson was murdered. He claimed to have been sleeping. And after Olson went out the window, Lashbrook actually telephoned Gottlieb in Washington. But Lashbrook, the assistant director of the chemical division at the CIA in Washington, was in the room and had gone to New York a week earlier with a one-day break, returning to Washington with Olson to actually do some damage assessment on Olson. Olson was preparing to leave his employment with Fort Detrick and the CIA, and had become fairly indiscreet about the way he talked about things, and the agency and the Army became very, very concerned about his being indiscreet. And he was a hard person to deal with to begin with, which I was surprised to learn, and he was a tough personality to deal with. When I initially read the Marx book, and then talked to a few other people, Olson came across, I think it actually says this in the Marx book, as a real fun-loving guy, practical joker that everyone liked and enjoyed being around because he was always funny and humorous. But when I really dug into Olson's personality, I found out just the opposite. A lot of people didn't like him at all because they perceived him to be fairly arrogant. He had a real problem with authority, which wasn't a good trait to have when you're working on a top secret military base. And there were a lot of altercations with Olson and various military people in terms of his entering and leaving the base. He didn't like to show proper credentials. And then on top of that, he was an anti-Semite, and that created a lot of problems for him, especially with people like Gottlieb and Abramson. And I wasn't sure how bad an anti-Semite he was until I interviewed his brother-in-law, a well-known social science professor in the country. And he told me he knew Frank. He was married to Alice, Frank's wife's sister, and he explained that Frank was so bad when Jewish people were around that he would actually leave. He said it was just horribly embarrassing and he couldn't take it. Initially, that threw me for a loop because there were so many people that Olson was working with that were Jewish, and according to his brother-in-law, he didn't tolerate Jewish people well at all and would go out of his way to offend them and to create embarrassing situations. I talked to Gottlieb about it. I interviewed Gottlieb a few times before he died, and I specifically brought it up with Gottlieb, and Gottlieb said he wasn't aware of it, and he always found Olson to be enjoyable to be around, and he always had good discussions with him, but I'm sure that was scripted.
You suggest, though, in your epilogue, that Frank Olson was also haunted to death by the nightmarish images of Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. Now, what happened there? Because I believe you were suggesting there was an experiment going on?
The government conducted, specifically the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, with Olson participating, and the CIA in August of 1951 conducted an experiment in this small town in southern France called Pont-Saint-Esprit with LSD. And the experiment was pretty horrifying. It affected, the numbers are vague, but between 500 and 600 people, basically as a result of the experiment, went stark raving mad for a day, and 4 committed suicide, and between 30 and 40 were carted off for extensive periods of time to mental institutions. When Olson became very indiscreet in the final few months of his life, that was one of the experiments he talked about, and that triggered a high level of concern on the part of both the agency and the Army. They didn't want that known at all. It's been said by others that Olson was threatening to go to the newspapers with that story, but I found no evidence of that whatsoever. And frankly, I think if he had gone to the newspapers, they probably would have turned him in, because in 1953, the newspapers weren't prone to do that kind of investigating and reporting towards the CIA. They really would have considered it their patriotic duty to turn Olson in. But Olson nonetheless did speak to some other people, mainly colleagues, who weren't privy to the experiment, who did turn him in. And that eventually, within a few months, led to his murder.
Murder, or were they trying to do to him what they did to the U.S. soldier to find out exactly who he told?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, they did do to him what they did to Thornley. They did it 9 days before his death at a secret meeting between the Army and the CIA that was held in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. That's a remote, rural part of Maryland, and there was a rendezvous there with a number of people from Fort Detrick, including Olson and his superior, and Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook and a couple other people from the agency. And Olson, at that gathering, was dosed with LSD and initially interrogated. And it was as a result of that interrogation, which came as a complete surprise to Olson, that 9 days later he was sent to New York for further damage assessment. And on the night that he died, he actually was trying to flee the room. And one of the reasons he was trying to flee the room is it had been determined earlier that day that he was, once he left New York, was going to be taken to a mental facility in Rockville, Maryland, that was called Chestnut Lodge, where it was a facility that the CIA very much favored use of for their own employees in the early 50s. And Olson, the decision had been made in New York to bring Olson back to Rockville, Maryland, and confine him in Chestnut Lodge, where it's my opinion he probably would have never come out of that experience alive. I mean, he was murdered in New York, but it was only because he tried to flee the hotel he was in, and there was a violent struggle that ensued with the two foreign nationals who had been charged with removing him from the room and taking him back to Rockville, Maryland. They didn't want him on an airplane the next day because days earlier he had tried to escape, and he was also begging to be allowed to disappear. He knew his number was up, and he was desperately trying to get away from his CIA and Army handlers.
Let's turn to, again, Gottlieb. I want to look at the testimony he gave in 1977, where he very, very calmly admits the CIA arranged this operation of covertly administering chemical materials to unwitting people. LSD and Meritran.
Yeah, it was common to give those to unwitting subjects, and that was given to Olson also. According to Gottlieb, he used it mixed in with LSD because he thought it intensified the experience, but at the same time smoothed it out a little bit. And usually towards the end you become withdrawn and tired and sometimes depressed. So that drug may have acted to smooth out the letdown towards the end. In the 60s and 70s, it was common for physicians to give college students who were tripping on LSD Thorazine to help them come down from the experience. But in my research, I've found that it was just as effective, mainly to maybe give someone, some hot milk and just talk them slowly down. I don't think it was really necessary to give them yet another drug on top of everything. But some people react very differently to LSD. And most people generally have a good experience on it if they know they're getting the drug and it's been explained to them what's going to happen. It's a completely different situation when somebody's unwittingly given the drug. Because your first reaction, and it's a normal reaction, is that I'm going crazy. That I don't know why, but something's happening, and I'm going crazy.
And of course, people wouldn't know when it was going to end either.
No, they'd have no clue. And after it would go on for, a half hour, much less 3 or 4 hours, it would be horribly frightening. And that's why in Pont Saint-Esprit and in other situations, people unwittingly given the drug would commit suicide because they thought they just weren't going to return to a normal state.
Returning to Sidney Gottlieb,
Mm-hmm.
he too in 1977 admits that not only did they covertly administer this chemical to unwitting people, no protections were given to the subjects. And here's a quote: "Where national security was concerned, such a procedure and such a risk was reasonable to take."
Yeah, that's kind of hard to swallow. There's a lot of hypocrisy in that because Gottlieb, it's also in another section of the book, Gottlieb took the drug himself. Gottlieb actually liked LSD and took it over 30 times himself and told me that every time he took it, it was beneficial to him. But what Gottlieb didn't explain when he said that before Congress and when he touted the drug in other situations was that the first few times he took the drug was with physicians present, a number of physicians who had also taken the drug prior and who were able to guide him through the experience. And then after that, it's fairly easy to take it alone because you know what to expect. But Gottlieb should have known better. When you're giving it to countless people, soldiers, people off the street, in an unwitting situation, it's just completely different. And he well knew that. Gottlieb in the 70s, it's interesting what happened to him. There was a decision made, and some of this I've found out subsequent to publishing the book. There was a decision made in the mid-70s when Olson's dosing with LSD was exposed through the Ford White House, through the Rockefeller Commission. But there was a decision made by the CIA and the White House that concerted efforts be made to draw the public's attention towards MKUltra. And they wanted people to focus on MKUltra as opposed to the project that Olson worked on, which was Project Artichoke. And the reason they wanted that simply was because MKUltra they knew was going to be exposed anyway, but that was the lesser of the two programs in terms of horrible things done. And MKUltra essentially, even though a lot of experiments were conducted under MKUltra was essentially a research program that had the effect of the CIA issuing about 150 subcontracts to colleges, universities, and research institutions all across the country. And it was actually those institutions and consultants that conducted the experiments we all know about today. But they didn't want people to focus on Project Artichoke because Artichoke was the operational arm of MKUltra. And all of the data and technology that looked very, very useful from MKUltra was actually put to practice operationally through Artichoke, both domestically and in Europe and in other countries. And they didn't want people to focus on that. And so the general counsel at the CIA, Lawrence Houston, actually had a couple meetings with Donald Rumsfeld and Richard Cheney, who were working in the Ford White House at that point in time, to manipulate both the media and the public away from Artichoke and towards MKUltra. And you can look back historically and see how effective that effort was, because even if you go on the internet and Google the two programs, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of references to the fact that MKUltra replaced the Artichoke program, and that's simply not true. They ran parallel to one another, and actually Artichoke ran for a longer period of time than MKUltra. But again, they wanted to draw people's attention away from Artichoke because it would lead people towards more information about what Olson had actually been doing, because Olson, during his last 3 years at Fort Detrick, had been a formal member of what the CIA called the Artichoke Committee, or it's more often called the Artichoke Conference. And that was basically the steering committee, the policy committee that passed on approval or disapproval of field experiments that would be conducted operationally by the CIA. And there were just a lot of horrible things that were done under Artichoke, and there were a lot of deaths overseas. A lot of foreign nationals were killed because of that program. And eventually Artichoke actually developed an arm that was focused on assassination. It was a multi-purpose program. It was experimental. It was aimed at interrogation. It was aimed at mind control, and they developed the means to control people to the extent that they'd go against their principles or moral beliefs and do everything, including kill others.
Well, there is a document in your book where former Vice President Cheney, then an advisor to White House Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld, says, apologize. He's describing exactly what should be said to contain this.
Right.
How much did he know?
There's actually, if you go to my website, that all of those documents, and there's about 30 or 40 of them, it appears to me that Cheney and Rumsfeld probably knew everything and had been briefed by the CIA. I don't think they certainly didn't know it at the time because they were pretty young when Olson was murdered. But I think in 1975, when the entire incident was raised through the Rockefeller Commission report, they found out pretty quickly that Olson had been murdered. And there's one document, a White House document, that actually points to that. It was the cover sheet to a fuller report that Cheney and Rumsfeld had seen. Unfortunately, we don't have that report, and I assume that was destroyed, or the CIA says it doesn't exist and never existed, but that kind of defies the fact that there is a cover sheet to it, and that cover sheet actually mentions or lists the names of both of Olson's killers, who were both French nationals, and it gives an identity number to each, and also gives an identity number to Pont Saint-Esprit. So obviously somebody had briefed Cheney and Rumsfeld as to what had really happened.
H.P. Albarelli is author of the acclaimed 2009 book, A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. In it, he documents the evidence about MKULTRA, Artichoke, Bluebird, and other secret operations, and reviews failed attempts at accountability.
We're also able to train soldiers that are deploying or being fielded these platforms through a training center that we run on the other side of Fort Detrick. And last week and this week, and we expect that it's pure and not contaminated with anything. And then we're able to concentrate it and then provide it in smaller, usable aliquots for the researchers to use. So essentially, you multiply it, you purify it, and then you divide it up.
How long does this work go on for?
Until they tell us they don't need it. Until it's not needed. So right now we're setting up assays to test this virus, so we'll need positive control material. So it's good to have the actual virus so we can run it through the tests alongside patient samples, which we will also be able to do here, so that we can test an actual positive against the patient sample to know whether or not their test result matches up.
So you want this to be the control?
We got one sample. Just one, and then we're very confident it's a whole bunch. Yes.
Is it a domestic case or did it come from overseas?
Yes, you're good, totally.
As far as I know, it was domestic.
Help us understand, and I know this is a broad question, what I'd like to explain to readers is when they hear 12 to 18 months, how do you sort of see that timeline playing
12 to 18 months of what context?
to create a vaccination?
To create a vaccine. There's a lot that goes into it. I mean, just starting with purification of the virus.
Like how long does that take here?
If everything goes well, it takes about 2 weeks.
Okay.
It's got to be at a certain concentration. There are certain metrics that have to be met for the virus to be usable. Then I actually think that John Dye, who you guys get to talk to a little bit later, can explain a little bit more about the actual vaccine production. So he's really just setting up the reagents and the materials, making sure that they're as pure as possible, as high concentrations we can get so that they're usable, so that the researchers that are doing the medical countermeasure development for therapeutics can actually get the best result as quick as possible.
So this is more about diagnostics. We'll be hearing more about vaccines and therapeutics and great work.
The core lab also has what we call an LRN. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the CDC LRN. There are 3 national level LRN laboratories in the United States. Of those three, only two have BSL-4 diagnostic capabilities. That is us and the CDC. So we have diagnostic capabilities that we can run under CLIA and CLIP, just like a clinical laboratory, and we would be ready to receive samples when they are ready.
And how many people are part of this purification?
Just purifying a virus usually takes about 2 or 3 people. But the core laboratory itself has about 25 people doing various things.
You know what PPE that you're wearing?
So she's got on underneath that PPE a set of scrubs that will never leave the laboratory, at least not until it's been autoclaved. And then on top of that, she's wearing an impermeable Tyvek. Andrea, what?
How do you spell that?
Oh,
We can get those names to you.
Thank you.
yeah.
I think we're ready to move on. If that's okay. We can get the names
I don't want to
to
carry
you.
you guys off your top line.
Right, but we can-
You have her spelling and all that?
yeah, I can get that for you. No problem.
She's culturing the virus. She's culturing the virus to make witches.
Thank you so much. Okay, guys, follow me.
From Vibrant,
Good.
So again, good morning, everyone. My name is John Dye. I'm the Chief of Viral Immunology here at USAMRIID, and we are standing in the back hallways for laboratory, BSL-3, and the 2 other laboratories that match this in the Institute. We actually have the largest BSL-4 capability in the world. So what does BSL-4 mean? Biosafety level 4 is where you work with very contagious agents. Let's take a step back. Biosafety level 1 would be if you were working at a laboratory at a university. You'd be working on the bench top. Maybe you would wear gloves and a lab coat if you needed. Biosafety level 2 would be if you were working in a laboratory, you would wear gloves, a lab coat, and when you did infectious work, you would work in a biosafety cabinet, a hood. That's the type of work you could do with HIV, as an example. Biosafety level 3 is you would have to don protective equipment like this gentleman is wearing right here. So you would be working with agents that have lethality, and they can be transmitted by aerosol, but they also have, in many cases, an existing available. So this gentleman is actually donned in BSL-3 garb. Then when you take it up one more level, you're talking about biosafety level 4, where you basically are working in a suit, as this gentleman is wearing, positive pressure encapsulation suit. That way everything is flowing out of the suit, away from the individual, and everything is flowing into the environment. So the agents that you would work with, so for instance for BSL-3, D-O-R-O-S-K-Y.
And the first name?
Danielle.
Danielle.
D-A-N in 2014 and 15. We also are developing treatments. So prevent. We developed both vaccines that are currently being used in the DRC for the current outbreak, as well as used in 2015 during that outbreak for Ebola. Treatment. We actually also developed all 4 treatments that are being for Ebola virus. So we're a full service shop, all the way from development, all the way to from discovery, all the way to that we need to be able to keep this going so we can be prepared for future outbreaks, such as this COVID outbreak that's occurring right now. Do you guys have any questions?
Can you give us a sense of what you're doing relative to COVID?
Sure. So at this time, the COVID work that's going on is we're actually growing up and characterizing the virus so that we can understand how that virus replicates or propagates itself, makes more copies of itself in the world, to test the vaccines and therapeutics in animal models that we're developing right here at USAMRIID. Whether that's a small animal model like a rodent or a larger animal model like a non-human primate. All that work is going on here at USAMRIID. Additionally, we're helping prepare first responders for how to don and dock the appropriate equipment so that they can be a part of the testing, widespread testing that is going on both in this state and across the world. Vaccinate them and then actually give them the virus to see if they get it. So we have to develop animal models that closely mimic or show us what we see in humans. So basically we look at rodents and non-human primates to see, okay, if we infect with the virus, do they display the same clinical signs and symptoms that we see in humans? Therefore, we can take our therapeutics and vaccines to FDA licensure. called the animal rule.
Is that phase 2 or?
So after a phase 1, where you look at if something has the ability to cause no harm in humans, then you would move it into a phase 2, and this enables phase 2 studies to move into humans.
How long is that process?
It can take anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on the animal model. So we're hard at work, but having that animal model is also important. Having that clinical data in a phase 1 study showing that it causes no harm is important. And then actually the production of that vaccine to the numbers that you can actually get it out into the population is another component that all adds into that timetable.
I don't mean to oversimplify the work you do, but if I were to say, in terms of explaining the year to 18 months, it's clinical data, it's animal modeling, and then it's production of the vaccine. Is that a fair way to describe it?
And others as well. So
We don't do vaccine production.
basically, once you have a vaccine, does it actually produce an immune response? So the purpose of the vaccine is you take a small bit of whatever the agent is that you're interested in, you put it into a person or an animal, and you see if it generates an immune response. It's your body's responding to that virus or bacteria. The idea is if you have that, then when you see the real virus or the real bacteria, your body's already primed. It's ready to go. So that's what a vaccine does. So you have to develop that vaccine, which is currently being done by Moderna and many others. Then they're going to put it into small animals to see if it induces immunogenicity. Then they just started putting it into humans in a phase 1 study to see if it doesn't cause any harm. So does the vaccine lead to any deleterious effects in that human population? Then after you do that, you start to assess in animal models, well, does it have efficacy? You know it doesn't cause any harm, but it actually doesn't do any good. Then from that point, you move up to scaling up development, which is not done here, scaling up production. And then you move it into whatever demographic and population as you have that vaccine product.
I'm sorry, you put it in humans first to make sure it doesn't do harm, and then animals?
You can do them concurrently,
Uh-huh.
or you can do them sequentially. It depends on the money flow.
So phase 1 is actually about the delivery mechanism.
Correct.
Not actually that you're putting.
It has nothing to do with efficacy. Phase 1 is just showing that you're doing no harm. It's showing that if you put that into a human, there isn't any unforeseen circumstances that can occur.
And that's where we are now.
That's where we are right now with some of the vaccines.
But toxicity testing, of course, is not done in humans.
Correct.
They're
See-
looking for things like side effects when
Yep.
you do a phase 1.
Exactly.
And are you doing phase 1 testing here?
So no, we are not doing phase 1 testing here. That's not in our mission. We're more in the development of the vaccines down at Walter Reed and other places around the world. Then we're developing those animal models so we can actually have that testing so that we can
Which is
have
going to be the next level.
That's why we're getting ramped up.
And that may actually be tougher.
It is challenging.
I think we're ready to. J-O-H-N?
Excuse me?
You said J-O-H-N?
Dave.
Dave, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Dave.
What you're looking at here is our training simulation laboratory. So the advantage that this gives us is that it allows us to exactly replicate the conditions that our laboratorians would see inside a level 4 laboratory without the obvious hazards of the biological agents themselves. So we can walk in there in street clothes. There's no hazard whatsoever. So a couple of the key features before we go inside. So all of our containment laboratories use what we call autoclaves. For those that aren't familiar with them, think of a big chamber that injects in red bags outside for ultimate disposal. So everything comes out through autoclave. Now, one thing that's a little bit different with our facility compared to some of the other level 4 facilities, cap, and then we put it inside another vial, threaded cap, and then we put that in a container that is treated with liquid disinfectant. So if you think about your household Lysol or something like that, that has basically ammonium compounds, and sometimes some of them have smells. This is the same basic principle here with the disinfectants that we use with level 4, because just like the coronavirus, all of the level 4 have very hazardous for stainless steel. So we use a combination of effectiveness with our disinfectant, but also we get the added benefit of keeping our equipment in good shape. The third distinguishing feature is our airlock. So if you imagine a bicycle tire, so you have a sealed rubber gasket. specialized equipment inside the containment suite, that it may not always be safe for our workers to fix or finely tuned machines when they're in the lab themselves. So you might have edges or sharp points or things like that. So what we do is we fumigate this airlock with the equipment inside, and then bring it out after it's been decontaminated. Right. So I can take you guys into the actual training lab itself. Please follow me. Our actual level 4 suits. So we have, and obviously the suits wouldn't be hanging up inside the laboratory itself. And I'll show you why in a second. So one of the for our personal protection. So this is the probably one of the single most distinguishing features.
Sorry, take your badge off.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I should have told you before you started.
It was backwards, but
Yeah.
It's standard breathing air, usually 19.5% oxygen, similar to what we have, what we breathe in the atmosphere. And there are strict regulations on contaminants or potential carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide content, other potential chemical hazards, and we test this. We have an automated system that tests that regularly, but we also send out samples on a periodic basis just to verify that our equipment is still functional, right? But the problem is that while you have very high quality air coming into the suit, I'm also limited in how far I can walk, right? So you have about 6, maybe 8 feet under the best of circumstances to be able to move inside the laboratory while you're on the airline. And this is a big adjustment for people who've never been in this type of environment before. So what that means is that one of the biggest things that we teach and train people in this environment is how to connect and disconnect from an airline, which sounds like a simple process, but if you have 2 thick gloves, one of them, usually think of a dishwasher equivalent in terms of gloves, it's trained regularly with our personnel. Now you do have about 2 to 3 minutes of residual air inside the suit after you disconnect. So it's not instant asphyxiation or anything like that, locate whatever they're looking for and come back to their spot.
So would they be transferring airlines in here? Is that why there's multiple in here?
Yes, ma'am. No, it's constant. So that's actually, which can weigh anywhere between 7 and up to maybe 18 pounds, which even on the surface doesn't sound like a lot, but if you wear it for 4 or 5 hours, it can add up, right? So the other thing is that because of our IoT, we don't have the ability to access email, it really is a sealed, isolated environment. So I'm generally in there for periods of time less than 2 hours. So I'm usually in there to observe a procedure, perform a lab work with our animal research or doing viral assays. I may only be able to tolerate working in that environment for 3 hours, but so Korea might last 5 or 6 hours doing the same procedure, and that's fine. So one thing that we stress in an isolated environment, one thing I would say about working in level 4 is that it's the safest laboratory on Earth. More than level 3, level 2, and the numbers back that up. North America laboratory acquired infection in the 45 years of doing level 4 work. Because of the training, because you are in an isolated environment, even though the bugs themselves can be quite hazardous for obvious reasons, right? But at the same time, another question we get is, well, it's so safe. Why don't you just work with everything in level 4? Well, one, it's very 100 plates an hour, and that same environment under level 4, at best, you're doing even very good people is potentially a hazard. Everyone has their own dedicated 4-digit PIN. you enter that pin, you go through this change room. At this point, I would be in dedicated scrubs, I'd be in dedicated socks, and that's it. At this point, the next thing I would do, excuse me, ma'am, is I would test my suit to make sure it's functional. So what I mean by that is that you look through the suit thoroughly, head to toe. The most important area you want to test is the gloves. And the reason why I say that is that our hands are what we use to touch everything. So whether I'm in a level 1 or a level 4 laboratory, the area of highest potential contamination is always going to be on the hands. So these are pretty hardy gloves, so you can pull on them, right? I test in between the fingers, right? And once I go through that, I make sure the suit is fully functional. Then I put it on, and imagine it. Both these doors are closed. Time? All right. And last thing anyone does is they trigger the. Is that? Yeah. They trigger the chemical shower. So if you imagine a car wash, go through a drive-through car wash where you got water and then soap and then water again to rinse your car. Same principle here. The only exception is it's water. It's that greenish yellow chemical that you saw in that reservoir, and then water again to clean the space. Coming back out, I go water, chemical, water, then back up to the personal shower. Total time in takes anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes. Going out, it's usually 10 to 15 minutes. So every single time I come in, I'm already losing 25 minutes. So that's why some of those efficiencies come in. And it's a credit to our dedicated scientists who are willing to do it. So,
example of transmission chain modeling that happens once you've gotten a lot with the Ebola outbreak. What you're seeing in front of you is an example of one of the current solutions for field sequencing. So we've provided this over the years, and we also provide reach-back support. So we've dealt with both Ebola outbreaks, the Zika outbreak, a number of other smaller outbreaks over the years were caused by sexual transmission. So for coronavirus, we've been supporting the Global Emerging Infectious Infections Surveillance Program, and we're also actively involved in supporting the animal model development that's going to be used to assess therapeutics. We're also the group that would be able to, for those studies. We also have provided a lot of resistance development assessments to FDA as part of the process of developing therapeutics.
And then help develop animal models.
Yes, and so we provide a lot of the data sets, gene expression, how the
Immune stable. We're interested in two parameters basically, living cells and infected cells. The number of infected cells informs us if the compound can inhibit viral infection rate. The number of living cells informs us if the compound is cytotoxic. Over this year, the clinical drug currently being used in clinical trials of COVID-19 patients. We identified it as a Ebola inhibitor of the hepatitis screens. Our outputs of the screening is image rates. These are focal imagers. They images of the cells, the real stem cells. Infected cells are shown here in green. Living cells are in blue. You can see as the more progressively we have, the less Ebola infected cells you see. And we can use software analysis to use in animal studies. And that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
So this is not a diagnostic. This is to measure.
This is to actually identify compounds that can progress to advanced studies and be developed as therapeutics and human pathogens. And with this assay, it's very flexible. We can test any human pathogen, any new human pathogen. That's one of the advantages.
So that's a level 3 virus. So would you do that here?
No, so that's
a
a great place about USAMRIID, the proximity of all of these advanced technologies to the biosafety 3 or 4. So what we use, we do the compound treatment. Within 2 hours, the cells that are treated and not infected, and then are transferred into containment, where we work with the virus. Then we have validated inactivation methods to ensure that there's again we do all our staining and all that.
So this is the equivalent of your test subjects.
This may not be done, but can I bring in the rest of the folks?
Yes.
And then
Second round,
we want them to stay with
there's
us.
a library thing, right? We get from library.
we don't want to have one essay, we want to have 3 or 4 so we can really be confident in the results. So good morning, this is the screening form. We can perform the high screening. And we can get that number even higher if needed. To be able to do that, we use these 2 robotic systems, the Janus and the Biomed, for compound treatment, as you can see here. We treat compounds, nutrient cells. Then we inactivate the plates so we can bring them outside again. And we use, we want to detect living cells and we want to detect infected cells. Infected cells let us know if the compound is inhibiting infection, and the number of living cells left lets us know if the compound is not toxic, it's killing the cell. Go over here and I can show you some examples. So one, sorry, just to jump down for me a little more. So what's in the biocontainment, which is the bars. Okay? And some compounds can be post-directed, but we use all kinds of our body bars. Regular interaction, etc. This group is patients with COVID-19 patients or we identify here as a woman and out of the class. And I'll just show you an example. We put in here how infected cells or viruses. We use this
Correct. Two of those labs are actually in the building. The other one's at the CDC in Atlanta. So, what we're going to see first is
So today I'm able to provide you with a little peek inside the USAMRIID laboratory. This is part of our core laboratory services laboratory. We have a lot of capability in this laboratory. One of the things that we are standing up in increasing the capacity of right now is our Albarelli diagnostic laboratory. I don't know if you give them so that there are 3 national level LRNs.
Yeah, we did it.
We did all that? Okay. So what Andrea is doing in the hood right now, has positive controls for the assay, we're using it and verify for other types of research or diagnostics that we help the researchers within the institute use. One of the other things that we have as part of our lab is the DOD's largest ISO certified biodefense materials repository. That allows us to do some TV on mature assay diagnostics here in the acquisition pipeline. Those that do get fielded or our partner collaborators then push on to the FDA or make it into the hands of the Fortified Center. We have a training site on the other side of the Fort Detrick where we can actually train technicians for coronavirus response. And that way we really have within USAMRIID the diagnostic capabilities within the core lab services, the ability to validate, verify hazards.
You get the resources you need to do this.
I think that it's early. I think that we are. There's a lot of movement.
We're pushing a lot of stuff this
Make a
way.
lot of
I mean, there's a lot of people that,
giving us.
it's going to come, when you're going to see it, it's like a spigot. It seems like it's going to open up
Yes, sir.
and it's going to come quick.
And I've had people there who do a good job of it at RTC level.
Yeah.
Logistics, less lines, officer systems, because we know that the potential of safety analyzers.
That's the
one point is a rabbit.
The big thing is, yeah, just know what you want, and it's going to come. It's just taking time to get to it.
But we're, right now,
It's a big thing with the testing, we're trying to get it so to scale, just, pick it up. That's the big thing.
we have space, people, and platforms. We know that getting the reagents in, getting the long strands.
Reagent, I've actually learned what that is as STEM.
No, sir. The CDC is making them, and then also they, I think, have subcontracted with IDT to
Yeah.
make them, so PCR reagents, they make them.
To appropriately provide a mimic of that disease in humans. So when it comes to a respiratory disease, you're looking at aerobiology. So what we're doing here, so let's take prevent. Look at a vaccine. So you vaccinate a group of animals, and then you can challenge them with the virus. This is a cladding that the same dose of the virus is given to each individual. We're looking at plethysmography. That means we're looking at their tidal volume. You and I, maybe of different sizes, maybe I breathe more deeply than you do, so you would be exposed longer to ensure we both have the same viral dose. So then we know the vaccine works in the same. Then we look at something, this is telemetry. These devices are installed within the animal and can provide moment to moment. So you know exactly when they became febrile, so it's not just the 3 times a day you check their temperature, it's immediate. So do we know if they're shedding virus before they're even febrile? Once their fever is down, do they continue to shed virus? So looking at means of detecting it. And then finally treatment. So you can evaluate therapeutics, infect them through this method, and then look at their viable means of therapy through that. So,
you can see the tiny degree that you're talking about. This is a learning last time.
Very quick jaunt here to a BSL-4 lab. I'm going to talk about posture, but I'll turn it over to Dr. Dye. He's going to talk a little bit about BSL conditions, and then we have a BSL-4 lab, actually.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you doing? Good. Excellent. So we're back in the back hallways of USAMRIID right now where the work actually really gets done. So basically right on the other side of this wall.
I'd like it to make the headquarters.
That was the implication.
The scientific work.
The scientific, there you go. All right.
Right on the other side of this wall, largest BSL-4 capability in the world to be able to work with agents that require that level of security and safety. So some people ask what it is that requires something to be at different biosafety levels. So I'm just going to run through it real quick. So biosafety level 1 would be if you were working in a laboratory at a university. You would maybe wear a lab coat, you would wear gloves if you were working with an agent. Biosafety level 3, this is the type of garb and donning and doffing of equipment that you would wear to allow protection against those agents. So basically you would be wearing this particular outfit and you would be working in a biosafety cabinet at the same time when you're working with those agents. Those agents would include COVID-19 and other agents such as that. Ones that can be spread by breath, this young lady in here. So this is Danny Durowski, she's in my lab. And this would be for working with agents like Lassa virus, Marburg virus, and agents like Ebola virus. So she actually is right now working on developing treatments against Ebola virus and its sister viruses, Marburg and Sudan, looking for something that's cross-reactive against all of them. So I think the Ebola virus outbreak actually allows me to highlight the capabilities of USAMRIID. So we talk about West Africa in 2014 and 15 to get us prepared to how to wear that equipment so they could be safe. We also were involved with developing the vaccines and treatments. So there are 2 vaccines and 4 treatments that are currently, and we prepare for protect the armed service member, but what we hope is that that also goes into a global setting. So, and that is really highlighted by what we're able to accomplish. So I thank you all for your time, and I can take any questions you guys have. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.
Have a good day. Thanks very much, Doctor. Yes, sir.
And the key advantage that it gives us over other facilities is it allows our institute to simulate the actual working conditions in a level 4 laboratory without the aspect of having to work with the agents themselves before they go in. So we can. So our safety cabinet for agent manipulation, an incubator for growth, and various centrifuges. But there are some notable differences. You have one emergency lighting right above you, sir. The blue and orange lights to indicate potential either breathing area issues or other issues within the facility. And the reason we rely much more on visual than audible alarms, sir, is because you're in a fully encapsulated suit. And so it affects your ability to hear and speak, among others. But by far the most, excuse me, sir. The most distinctive feature of the level 4 laboratory is the use of airlines. So we all rely on airline delivered positive pressure encapsulating suits. So the airlines not only function as the lifeline of your breathing air, sir, but also they serve as a secondary barrier. So it's a positive pressure suit. In the case of a breach to the suit itself, it serves as a secondary air current to protect you against any biological hazards. Into the suite, sir. Personnel would enter through our chemical disinfectant shower. If you imagine just a mini car wash, sir, it's a chemical water rinse process. So going in, you are not required to shower in, but going out, you rinse and clean the suit out. After that, the suit comes off, and you're down to dedicated scrubs, socks, and an inner pair of gloves. And then going back out, you also have to take a personal shower. So one of our phrases is you actually come out cleaner than you went coming in. And just one last thing I do want to show you, sir, is that we do use a variety of suits. This was developed in partnership with a private company, as well as contributions from USAMRIID Safety and our principal scientists in Level 4. So this we're the first.
But it's similar problem. Which way we're going?
Yes, sir.
What I'm trying to figure out, how do you using
Medical and Research Development Command, Brigadier General Michael Talley, and Colonel Darren Cox, the Commander of Medical, U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. And we'll turn it over to Secretary McCarthy for a few comments, and then we'll start questions.
How do you hear me? How you hear me? You guys hear me? Sorry about that. I'll give you a little framework of what we just discussed this morning, but we can clearly talk about all activities that the U.S. Army are taking in support of the Commander-in-Chief's guidance for the fight against COVID-19. So this morning, the General McConville and the SMA and I sat down with MRDC leadership and went through the three lines of operation of prevention, detection, and treatment that the Medical Research and Development Command is organized against this extraordinary challenge. And so we talked a little bit about the infusion of funding that's come from the second and then the supplemental that was just passed the other night, but also the request for just shy of $900 million to finance those activities across those three lines of effort. How the team has postured itself to expand its capacity to attack those lines of effort. There's about 5 tracks of vaccine efforts with a couple dozen candidates that are being worked between the private sector and the government, and they talked us through how they're looking at these various candidates and ultimately will select the best horse to back and get through the process. As well as on the prevention side, we looked at the diagnostic kit capacity and how they're working with industry to increase capacity of testing from both a mobile site to as well as some much more larger scale national-like capabilities. And as well as on the treatment front. They actually walked us through how the soldier in Korea, who was one of the first soldiers infected by this terrible virus, and how his treatment has been going. Very fortunately for us, an officer who was stationed here is one of his attending physicians forward, so they have great relationships and passing of the information. I tell you, it's extraordinary the pressure that is under that soldier's family, and he's donating his blood, and he is doing everything he can to be supportive in this process. So God bless him and his family as he gets through this fight. We got to spend a few hours with some extraordinary Americans who were at the forefront of this fight, and we're getting them all the resources that they can, trying to get them as much time and energy as they can so to knock down any roadblocks that are in their path of moving samples, getting through bureaucratic hurdles. So putting the entire weight of the Army behind this effort. I'd like the Chief to make a couple of comments, and then maybe we can open up for questions. General McConville.
Thank you, Secretary. And really, while our Army is deployed around the world in 140 countries, conducting combat operations and assuring partners and allies that we stand with them. We are working at the national, we're working at the state, and we're working at the local level to provide the assistance that we can for prevention, for detection, and treatment. And the heroes in this fight are going to be some of the people we saw today, the scientists that are working to find the vaccinations, the scientists that are working to find the drugs for treatment, the scientists that are aggressively increasing the capacity of the testing capability, and then all those medical professionals, those doctors, those nurses that are throughout the country that are really going to defeat this virus. But we are here to assist them, and we are very proud of what they are doing.
Nancy, start questions with you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, General Hondo, there's been an announcement today that U.S. troops will no longer be going in and out of Afghanistan. I'd like to ask you if you see that expanding to other COCOMs, that decision, and if so, at what point does the suspension of troop movements affect readiness, and do you potentially see a shortage of resources in CONUS as U.S. troops are not able to come back from overseas?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is commanders are doing risk assessments in each of their theaters. They're making sure that they have the appropriate force available to conduct the mission. That's what General Miller is doing. He's assessing the situation over the next 30 days, and he'll basically do an assessment of risk to the mission, which he's trying to accomplish, and risk to the force, and we'll work that very closely with him.
And at what point do you see it potentially affecting readiness overall? Could it extend to the other COCOMs potentially?
Well, I think what you're going to see is, over the next 30 to 60 days, we're watching this very, very closely, and then providing the resources for screening and testing so we get an assessment of what the risk to the force is, and then from that we can determine what the risk to the mission is. And so we don't know yet exactly how that's going to play out, but we do have the procedures and measures in place to conduct the missions and at the same time protect the force.
We'll move to Heather for the Frederick News Post.
Mr. Secretary General, so a little bit ago, there was an announcement that $104 million was being withheld from USAMRIID and USAMRIID on the conditions, including that USAMRIID needed to be back at full capacity. Is there any update on the release of that money?
Over the last, I guess it was 8 or 9 months, there was work that had been going on back and forth between the MRDC and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The business model for this organization is a reimbursable model, and so eight other government agencies would then come here and apply, put work orders in, and they would conduct the research. What you're reflecting is the funding associated with that. There was some back and forth just about the operating model of how things would work, and I would defer to General Talley any other specifics I may miss. But that was a part and parcel with just how it operates. The MRDC has been moving towards a rate board so that they could much more clearly articulate the costs of how the work gets done, and that going forward will operate under that different model. With respect to resources, though, over the last, I would say 30 days, General Talley, correct me if I'm wrong, we've been moving millions and millions of dollars. There's a $900 million request that's in the third supplemental, so there's an infusion of financial resources that are coming to MRDC. General Talley, anything you want to add?
Absolutely. And with respect to the COVID efforts, we have to think of that completely separate and different from our funding streams. And Secretary of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Army, very good at just securing the dollars that are going to come in for that specific research. And with respect to RID, U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, if you think of a twofold mission, which one is for research, the basic research that goes after the diseases, the non-battle injuries, if you will, that affect our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And then there's a response mission, like what we're facing right now with COVID. If you go back to the Ebola crisis, even Zika, this laboratory has played an important role in the discoveries towards prevention, treatment, and detection. So completely different funding stream. We're working well right now with OSD for that the temporary funding withhold, again, getting the financial apparatus to where we can manage effectively. But with respect to COVID-19, no disruptions whatsoever, and we're expecting, in fact, we've actually received additional funding for that effort. Thanks for the question.
Go to Rachel from ABC.
Mr. Secretary General, I appreciate your time. Mr. Secretary, you called this an extraordinary challenge and mentioned that you guys are trying to, overcome some of these roadblocks. Are there additional resources that could be put towards this fight? Is the Army can you be doing more?
It looks at a variety of different capabilities that can be brought forward, whether it's medical support, but it's also the research like we're talking about here. We're learning every day around the country, and we're learning from in Korea, in Italy, and one thing that I was remiss to say in my opening remarks is just the extraordinary performance of General Abe Abrams in Korea and Major General Roger Cloutier in Italy, of how they've been able to protect the force forward in some very tough environments. We've learned a lot from the tactics, techniques, and procedures, just how they prevented the outbreak and be able to protect the force in this difficult climate. I don't know if you're referring to doing more for around the country. We have combat support hospitals on prepare to deploy orders. The U.S. Navy's deploying their ships, the Comfort and the Mercy, which are hospital ships. We have additional capabilities that we're looking at, but a lot of it comes down to working with the state levels and knowing what their needs are, and then ultimately the Commander-in-Chief will make a decision and push those capabilities forward.
Louis, did you have a question?
If I could ask both of you, since there's so little that is known about this disease and this virus, how is it going to impact your recruiting goals for this year? What adjustments are you making, or will you be making, when it comes to the throughput of recruits into their units, or even into basic training itself?
I would say initially that I think the Chief should comment as well, but we were in very good shape with this recruiting cycle, actually ahead of goal, substantial ahead, so we have some margin at this point, but we're learning every day. Is this a flu virus that is seasonal? Will it boomerang back in this next cycle? Every day we know more. So when you hear the leaders like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redfield talking about testing, and we're getting more data every day, and we're getting smarter on this problem every day. The measures that we've taken, a lot of it is risk-based. There are areas of the country that are being affected more than others, Washington State, New York. And if you look at young men and women that feel like they need to stay home and be with their families, we're looking at options like delayed bonuses and others so that we can keep them in the queue, try to weather through this very difficult period, and then ship later. So I think Major General Frank Muth at Army Recruiting Command is doing a remarkable job. I mean, he's 45 here, 50 there. He's got his finger on the pulse of this effort. We're looking at measures of how do you move troops through the MEPS process and ultimately to a recruiting location, but we got to be as safe as we can. We have got to be able to protect the force. The world is complex and dangerous on any given day. Now you add these additional conditions. We're literally managing this on a case-by-case basis in the department, and we're making very appropriate risk-based decisions. Chief?
Yeah, parents are sending us their sons and daughters, and we have an obligation to take care of them. Many of these young men and women were expecting to go to work, so they may have quit their jobs to go ahead and serve, so we're very cognizant of that. As the Secretary said, if for some reason the situation does not allow them to ship, then we're looking at ways we can possibly compensate them so they're not unemployed and they made a commitment to us. But the second thing is we're putting in place is measures all along the way to protect these young men and women. So when they go to the recruiter, they'll before they leave the recruiter, they'll be screened. When they go to the military entrance processing station, which we like to call MEPS, I had to kind of remember what that meant because I thought you might ask me, but that's where they go. We're doing the same type of screening there. And then when they go to one of our 4 training sites, whether it's Fort Jackson, Fort Benning, Fort Leonard, or Fort Sill, is we want to again, bring them in, test them, and then have the capability if someone shows some of the symptoms, we have the ability there to go ahead and quarantine them and make sure they have the necessary medical capability so their safety is secured all the way through the process. And what we're really trying to do with our bases, in a lot of ways, is what General Abrams found is the closer you can make it to a bubble, a safety bubble, where everyone is screened and we're not in a position to be affected by the coronavirus, the better off we'll be. But we are piloting that this week. We've kind of reduced the amount of recruits that we would normally send. We'll see how that plays out, and we're going to adapt the process and come back with some recommendations.
So you're not recommending it to, so at this time you're not recommending accepting recruits into the basic training?
No, we are. We're shipping right now. We are.
No, but you're not going to stop.
Right now, what we're doing is we're putting procedures to allow us to continue to ship, and that's going to be based on the risk. So soldiers will continue to ship to basic training.
But literally getting down case by case. You were on this VTC with us yesterday. You would have seen Major General Frank Muth was drilling down into zip codes of just where these young men and women are coming from, making risk-based decisions, communicating with them based off of challenges they may face in their neighborhoods, and we're going to manage that accordingly and look to see if you can put in a delayed bonus or something of that nature to keep them in the queue, but should try to weather through this very, very difficult period.
Nancy, do you have a follow-up?
I just want to follow up to Rachel's question, if I could. We heard yesterday that there's 1,000 beds available through, I think, the Army and the Air Force for military hospitals. Can you tell us what units have been called up, how many could be called up, and what capacity you could offer in terms of military certified hospitals going forward?
There's 2 combat support hospitals that are on prepared to deploy orders. So that's a very short string, bags packed, getting ready to go. Now, each one of those hospitals, correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, is 264 beds in each of those 2 hospitals. And then they have ICU capability. 284. Excuse me. We'll get you the math.
We'll get you the math.
But that's 2 of these hospitals, 2 field hospitals. We have more capabilities, but obviously we have 191,000 troops deployed right now. So we have the baseline of capabilities, and we're working with the Office of Secretary of Defense on the capabilities to bring forward. But one thing we really need to think about is the National Guard is on the front edge of this. Guard units supporting in their states. What I think they're referring to, the quote you're referring to was General Friedrichs from the Joint Staff.
Yes.
He was talking about some active duty capabilities that we could bring very quickly to the most affected states at this point, Washington State and New York in particular, that they're on the short string to support that initially. Now, but I think it's very important to truly, in your reporting, to look and see just how much the National Guard is doing at this juncture. Chief, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I do want to talk about the National Guard. One of the decisions that you heard we made, the 81st Stryker Brigade Combat Team will not deploy to the Combat Training Center. And that's a fairly significant event because those soldiers are coming from Washington and California. So one of the ways we support the community, quite frankly, is saying, hey, we're not going to take those guardsmen and put them in a training environment because we're anticipating that they, when we talk to the states, they need to be used locally to help with logistics, to help with medical. And so those are some of the type of things we're doing. And many of, when you look at the Secretary talked about, we have different types of hospitals. We have what we call a combat support hospital that has 248 beds. We're in the process of, transitioning to field hospitals that have 32 beds, but they can be augmented. So we have different capabilities that we're putting on, we're on the active force. We're saying, okay, who's ready to go? Who's not ready to go? Get ready to go. But the other thing is we're doing risk mitigation. Because these doctors, these doctors, these nurses, these medical professionals, they also work in our medical treatment facilities. And on our reserve side, many of these medical professionals, they're actually working in the community. So if we take them and call them up in the reserves, we may be taking them out of the very communities that we're trying to help. So that's what we're going down to the person. Is this person, engaged in providing medical support in an area that they really need them. If we call them up, are we going to hurt the community? And we're getting down to that level on who we pick.
And as well as what the chief mentioned is changing the configuration of these hospitals from just pure trauma to working infectious diseases. They're in the process of that and be ready shortly.
And that's a point which I really want to reinforce the Secretary made. You know, these hospitals are really designed for combat type operations, trauma, gunshot wounds, blasts, and those type things. They're not really designed for infectious diseases. But what the military can do is maybe take the load off and, you know, allow, you know, the civilian hospitals to focus on these issues. The other thing we're doing is our Corps of Engineers is working very closely with at least 4 governors we know right now. Our head of the engineers, General Todd Sumnight, met with the New York governor. And, you know, people talk about can we build hospitals? Well, we think the fastest way is to take a look at hotels and dormitories that are available, and then rescope them, you know, maybe put in the power they need. We can do that very, very quickly. Some even talking about putting under pressure into the capability, so, you know, that if there's any type of disease, it stays in, it doesn't go out, but we can quickly build capacity in this way. We did this during World War II. The Greenbrier, which sits out, if anyone's ever been to Greenbrier, was an Army hospital during World War II, so this is not something new.
Do you see the idea of using hospitals and dormitories, is that imminent? Is that something we can expect to see as a decision being made, or is that an idea that's...
Well, what we're doing is we're working with the governors. You know, one of the things that we is give them options. You know, we can build. We have the capability. We say build Army engineers. What they're doing is contracting. They have the capability to bring in the expertise. They're not actually. You know, we're not putting Army engineers to build that. But what we're doing is offering those governors options. You know, we can build, but it may take you this long to build. We can kind of scope these dormitories and hotels, or we come up with some other options. And you know, a lot of these situations, like large open tents, aren't really the best place to put people with infectious diseases all together. So we're working through some options and giving them some options that they can work with.
So, Mr. Secretary, you got to see some of the work that's done at USAMRIID, but not that long ago, a lot of that work was shut down by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So I just, two-part question, how did that affect USAMRIID's ability to respond to COVID-19 and the SARS-CoV-2? And also, is there an update on whether USAMRIID is going to be soon at full operations again?
Yeah, if I could take that one. Good question, and certainly we've had to gradually come back after the shutdown. The CDC has revisited USAMRIID 2 times, each time allowing more of the laboratory science to be allowed. Under the strict regulatory requirements of the CDC, it's come back much faster than anticipated. COVID-19 is not considered a bioselect agent, so it's not under the same restrictions. In fact, when it was known that USAMRIID would be involved, first phone call went to the CDC, and they assured me, no, we absolutely need USAMRIID's help on this, like they have with other responses. This is not it doesn't fall under the same category. The same restrictions do not apply. But with respect to the other types of work, they were released, or actually allowed to conduct a second wave, if you will, of experimentation, which brings us up to about the BSL-3 type of capability. And that's continuing to be a gradual process back to full operation capability, if you will. But again, with the COVID-19 efforts, we're allowed to go full speed, if you will, with full operational capabilities.
Rachel? Another opportunity. This is great.
Last question.
What is, if I can ask the Sergeant Major, what are some of the expectations, or what are some of the concerns that you're hearing about returning soldiers coming back from overseas? We've heard a case about what's going on at Fort Bliss and some other bases when they're being quarantined. Obviously, we have these social distancing measures in place, but it doesn't sound like they were being implemented fully when they return. So, if you follow,
you know, first of all,